the Atlantic waves crashed against the steel hull of the landing craft. As Private Thomas Mitchell gripped his rifle tighter, his knuckles white against the dark metal, around him dozens of American soldiers sat in tense silence, their faces pale in the pre-dawn darkness. The engines roared above the sound of churning water, carrying them toward a beach that would either become their salvation or their grave. 30 seconds, shouted the coxswain over the mechanical din. Mitchell's heart pounded as he thought of the letter from his wife Sarah, tucked safely in his breast pocket. The massive Allied armada stretched endlessly across the English Channel, over 5,000 ships carrying 150,000 men toward the heavily fortified coast of Nazi-occupied France. This was Operation Overlord, the largest seaborne invasion in human history, and the fate of Europe hung in the balance. The German machine guns opened fire as the first wave of Allied troops stormed the beaches. At Omaha Beach, where Mitchell's unit was headed, the enemy had transformed the coastline into a killing field. Concrete bunkers bristled with artillery, while steel obstacles and mines created deadly barriers in the surf. The sound of bullets whizzing overhead mixed with the screams of wounded men and the thunderous explosions of naval bombardments. General Dwight David Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, had made the most crucial decision of the war just hours earlier. Despite threatening weather conditions that had already delayed the invasion by 24 hours, he gave the final order, "Okay, we'll go." The meteorologists had predicted a brief window of acceptable conditions, and Eisenhower knew that another delay could push the invasion back weeks, potentially allowing the Germans to strengthen their defenses further. As Mitchell's landing craft approached the beach, he could see the carnage unfolding. The first waves of infantry were pinned down by devastating crossfire from German positions on the bluffs above. Bodies floated in the bloodied surf while survivors desperately sought cover behind the steel obstacles that the enemy had placed to prevent their advance. The carefully planned timetable was already falling apart as units became separated, and communication broke down under the intensity of the German response. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's supposedly impregnable fortress stretching from Norway to Spain, was being tested for the first time by a major Allied assault. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had spent months strengthening these defenses. Convinced that the invasion must be stopped at the water's edge, his beach obstacles, minefields, and interlocking fields of fire had turned the Norman coast into a death trap for any would-be invaders. But the Allies had advantages that the Germans could not match. The deception operation known as Fortitude had convinced Hitler and his generals that the main invasion would come at Pas de Calais, keeping crucial German reserves away from Normandy. Meanwhile, the Allied air forces had achieved near-complete air superiority, and the massive naval bombardment was beginning to suppress some of the German coastal batteries. As Mitchell's craft ground against the sandy bottom, the ramp dropped with a metallic clang. "Go, go, go!" The sergeant's voice cut through the chaos as the men charged into the surf, many falling immediately to the withering German fire. Mitchell splashed through the cold water, his equipment weighing him down as bullets kicked up geysers of sand around his feet. The liberation of Europe had begun, but victory was far from certain. Staff Sergeant William O'Brien pressed his face against the cold sand of Omaha Beach, German bullets whining inches above his helmet. Around him, the remnants of the 1st Infantry Division's 2nd Battalion lay scattered across the tidal zone, many never to rise again. The carefully orchestrated assault had devolved into a desperate struggle for survival against the murderous crossfire pouring down from the bluffs. "We're getting slaughtered here," shouted Corporal James Murphy, his voice barely audible over the thunder of artillery and machine gun fire. The young soldier from Boston had aged years in the past hour, his boyish face now streaked with sand and blood. O'Brien knew they couldn't remain pinned down much longer. The rising tide would soon leave them completely exposed. The German defenders of the 352nd Infantry Division had been waiting for this moment. Many were veterans of the brutal Eastern Front, hardened by years of warfare against the Soviet Union. From their concrete bunkers and camouflaged positions, they commanded perfect fields of fire over the killing ground below. Every yard of beach had been surveyed and registered by their artillery. turning the landing zone into a precisely calibrated death trap. According to historical accounts from the National Archives, the initial casualty reports were staggering. Entire companies had been virtually eliminated in the first hour of the assault. The pre-invasion bombardment, which was supposed to neutralize the German defenses, had largely missed its targets due to poor visibility and the fear of hitting Allied troops offshore. The enemy positions remained intact and deadly. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Canham, wounded but still commanding his battalion, rallied his men with a roar that somehow carried over the din of battle. "They're murdering us here. Let's move inland and get murdered." His dark humor masked a desperate tactical reality. The only way off the beach was through the German defenses, not around them. At Utah Beach, the situation was markedly different. The 4th Infantry Division, led by Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., had landed nearly 2 miles off target, but discovered that their mistake had placed them in a lightly defended sector. Roosevelt, the 56-year-old son of the former president, hobbled across the beach on his cane, personally directing the establishment of the beachhead despite his age and infirmities. The British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches were making better progress than their American counterparts at Omaha. The 3rd Infantry Division and the 50th Northumbrian Division had successfully established footholds and were beginning to push inland. At Juno Beach, Canadian units were advancing with such speed that they threatened to outpace their carefully planned objectives. Back at Omaha, the tide was beginning to turn, literally and figuratively. Destroyer crews, observing the carnage on the beach, had begun sailing dangerously close to shore to provide direct fire support. The USS McCook and USS Carmack were so close that their crews could see individual German soldiers in the bunkers. Their 5-inch guns began systematically destroying the concrete fortifications that had been holding up the advance. Individual acts of heroism were emerging from the chaos. Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment stood up amid the carnage and delivered words that would echo through history. "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach: the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." His rallying cry sparked a spontaneous advance up the bluffs as small groups of soldiers began infiltrating the German positions. The German response was hampered by their rigid command structure and Hitler's interference. The Fuhrer had retained personal control over the Panzer reserves, and his staff was reluctant to wake him during the critical early hours of the invasion. By the time German armored units received orders to counterattack, the Allies had established multiple footholds that would prove impossible to eliminate. As the sun reached its zenith on June 6th, the character of the battle was shifting. What had begun as a carefully orchestrated invasion was becoming a test of will and endurance. The Allied forces were establishing their presence on European soil, but the cost was proving higher than anyone had anticipated. The longest day was far from over. Captain Richard Hayes crouched behind a knocked-out German pillbox, studying the maze of trenches and bunkers that stretched inland from Omaha Beach. The morning sun cast long shadows across the scarred landscape, revealing the full extent of the Atlantic Wall's defenses. Dead Germans lay scattered around their positions, testament to the savage fighting that had finally broken their resistance along the bluffs. "Sir, we've got movement in the village ahead," reported Sergeant Michael Collins, his binoculars trained on the cluster of stone buildings that marked the outskirts of Vierville-sur-Mer. The Irish-American non-com had proven invaluable during the beach assault, his calm demeanor helping to steady the younger soldiers during the worst of the fighting. Hayes nodded grimly. The breakout from the beaches was only the beginning of their ordeal. Intelligence reports indicated that the Germans had constructed multiple defensive lines inland, each designed to channel Allied forces into prepared killing zones. The bocage country of Normandy, with its ancient hedgerows and sunken roads, provided natural fortifications that the enemy had spent for years improving. The German response to the invasion had been swift but uncoordinated. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, composed largely of teenage fanatics, was racing toward the beachhead with orders to drive the Allies back into the sea. Their commander, SS Oberfuhrer Kurt Meyer, had promised his men that they would be throwing the fish back into the water before nightfall. At the same time, the German 7th Army headquarters was struggling to determine the scope of the Allied assault. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander of German forces in the West, believed that Normandy was merely a diversion for the main invasion that would surely come at Pas-de-Calais. This fatal misreading of Allied intentions would keep crucial German reserves away from the decisive battlefield. The Allied air forces were proving their worth in the inland battle. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts and Hawker Typhoons prowled the Norman skies, pouncing on any German vehicles that dared to move during daylight hours. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, could muster only a handful of sorties against the massive Allied air armada. Lieutenant Robert Anderson's tank platoon was among the first Sherman units to push inland from the beaches. The 32-ton medium tanks had finally made it off the sand, their tracks churning through the soft earth as they sought hull-down positions among the hedgerows. Anderson knew that his Shermans were outgunned by the German Panthers and Tigers, but Allied numerical superiority was beginning to tell. As reported in wartime dispatches from CBS correspondent Edward R. Morrow, the civilian population of Normandy found themselves caught between the opposing armies. French villagers who had endured for years of occupation now faced the prospect of their homes becoming battlefields. Many had fled to cellars and caves, while others attempted to aid the advancing Allied forces with information about German positions. The establishment of the beachhead was creating a massive logistical challenge for the Allied forces. Every gallon of fuel, every round of ammunition, and every medical supply had to be brought across the blood-soaked beaches. The artificial harbors known as mulberries were still being constructed, forcing supply ships to unload directly onto the sand under constant threat of German artillery fire. By the evening of June 7th, the Allied forces had established a continuous front roughly 6 miles inland. The initial objectives had not been met. The city of Caen was still in German hands, and the planned link-up between the various beachheads had not been achieved. But the Atlantic Wall had been irreparably breached, and German hopes of crushing the invasion at the water's edge had been shattered. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding the British 21st Army Group, was already planning the next phase of operations. The methodical British commander knew that the Germans would mount increasingly desperate counterattacks to prevent the Allies from breaking out of the beachhead. His forces would need to hold their ground while building up supplies and reinforcements for the battles ahead. In his bunker beneath the Norman countryside, Field Marshal Rommel was reporting to Hitler that the invasion could not be stopped at the beaches. The desert fox, who had once seemed invincible in North Africa, now faced the reality that Germany's Atlantic Wall had failed in its primary mission. The liberation of Europe had begun, but the hardest fighting still lay ahead. Major David Thompson adjusted his binoculars as he studied the medieval spires of Caen. Rising from the Norman countryside, the ancient city, which had been a D-Day objective for the British forces, remained stubbornly in German hands 8 days after the invasion. From his position with the 3rd Infantry Division, Thompson could see the smoke rising from the urban battlefield where British and Canadian forces were locked in brutal street fighting. With SS defenders, Jerry's not giving up that city without a fight, observed Lieutenant Paul Morrison, his voice carrying the weariness of constant combat. The young officer from Manchester had lost half his platoon in the hedgerow fighting, and the prospect of urban warfare filled him with dread. Street fighting was the most dangerous form of combat, where every building could hide a sniper and every intersection might be swept by machine gun fire. The German defense of Caen had been entrusted to the 12th SS Panzer Division, whose youthful soldiers fought with the fanaticism of true believers. Their commander, SS Standartenführer Kurt Meyer, had positioned his forces in the industrial suburbs and medieval streets, turning every stone building into a fortress. The Hitler Youth Division, as it was known, showed no mercy to captured Allied soldiers and expected none in return. General Montgomery's plan for a rapid capture of Caen had been thwarted by the unexpected tenacity of the German defense. The British Second Army, spearheaded by the 7th Armored Division, had made repeated attempts to encircle the city, but had been stopped by well-coordinated counterattacks. The Desert Rats, veterans of the North African campaign, found themselves struggling against an enemy that refused to retreat. The civilian population of Caen was enduring unimaginable suffering. Allied bombing raids, intended to support the ground assault, had reduced much of the historic city center to rubble. The Gothic Cathedral of St. Pierre, which had survived centuries of warfare, was heavily damaged by the bombardment. French civilians huddled in cellars and crypts, trapped between the opposing armies. Operation Epsom, launched on June 26th, represented Montgomery's most ambitious attempt to break the German line. The British 8th Corps, supported by over 700 artillery pieces, attacked toward the Udon River Valley in an effort to outflank Caen from the west. The assault initially made good progress, with the 15th Scottish Division advancing several miles against determined German resistance. The German response was swift and brutal. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, recently arrived from the Eastern Front, launched a series of counterattacks that threatened to cut off the British advance. The veterans of Kursk and Stalingrad brought their hard-won experience to bear against the advancing Allied forces. Tiger tanks of the 501st Heavy Tank Battalion stalked the Norman countryside, their 88mm guns claiming victim after victim among the lighter Allied armor. As documented in official British war diaries, the fighting around Caen reached a level of intensity that shocked even veteran commanders. The 12th SS Panzer Division was taking casualties at an unsustainable rate, but their youthful soldiers continued to fight with desperate courage. Many were teenagers who had known nothing but Nazi indoctrination, and they viewed the battle as a holy crusade against the forces of Allied terror bombing. The Royal Air Force was providing close support for the ground forces, but the proximity of friendly troops limited their effectiveness. Hawker Typhoons armed with rockets prowled the battlefield, seeking targets among the German armor. The Luftwaffe, however, had been virtually eliminated from the Norman skies, managing only sporadic appearances by small formations of fighters. Captain James Mitchell of the Sherwood Foresters led his company through the rubble-strewn streets of Caen's outskirts. Every advance was measured in yards, with German snipers and machine gun nests exacting a heavy toll on the attacking infantry. The close quarters fighting required skills that were difficult to teach. Urban warfare was an art form that demanded both courage and cunning. The German high command was beginning to realize that Caen could not be held indefinitely. The city's strategic importance lay in its road network and surrounding airfields, but the cost of defending it was becoming prohibitive. Hitler's orders to hold every inch of ground were proving impossible to execute against the overwhelming Allied material superiority. By early July, the battle for Caen had become a grinding war of attrition. Both sides were taking heavy casualties, but the Germans could not replace their losses while the Allies continued to build up their forces. The medieval city had become a symbol of German resistance, but that resistance was slowly being ground down by the remorseless pressure of the Allied advance. Colonel Henry Patterson felt the earth tremble beneath his feet as the largest concentrated bombing attack in history began to unfold above the Norman countryside. Nearly 3,000 Allied aircraft filled the sky, their bomb bay doors opening to release a carpet of death across the German positions near Saint-Lô. Operation Cobra, the long-awaited breakout from the Normandy beachhead, was about to begin. "Jesus Christ," whispered Sergeant Robert Kelly, his Irish accent thick with awe as he watched the massive formations of Boeing B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses thunder overhead. The ground troops had been pulled back to avoid the devastating bombardment, but even at this distance, the concussion from the explosions was overwhelming. The very air seemed to vibrate with the power of Allied air superiority. The target of this unprecedented aerial assault was the German defensive line, anchored on the town of Saint-Lô. The Panzerlehr Division, one of Germany's elite armored units, had been holding this sector with typical German efficiency. Their commander, General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, had created a defensive network that had frustrated every previous Allied attempt to break through. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army, had spent weeks planning this operation. The methodical commander from Missouri knew that previous attempts to break through the bocage had failed. Because they lacked sufficient concentration of force, Cobra would be different, a narrow front assault supported by overwhelming firepower. That would punch a hole in the German line. The bombing continued for over an hour, with each aircraft group assigned specific target areas to ensure complete coverage. The German defenders huddled in their bunkers and foxholes, praying that the massive concrete structures would protect them from the rain of high explosives. Many would not survive the ordeal, while others would emerge so shell-shocked that they could barely function. Unfortunately, the precision bombing proved less precise than planned. Some bombs fell short of their targets, landing among the American troops who were preparing to attack. The 3rd Battalion of the 125th Infantry Regiment suffered particularly heavy casualties, with several companies virtually eliminated by their own air support. Among the victims was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer to be killed in the European theater. Despite the tragic friendly fire incidents, the bombing had achieved its primary objective of devastating the German defenses. The Panzer-Lehr Division had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force, with most of its tanks and vehicles destroyed or abandoned. Behrlein himself barely escaped the bombardment, emerging from his bunker to find his carefully prepared positions obliterated. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commanding the American 7th Corps, ordered his infantry forward as soon as the bombing ceased. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, led the assault against the shattered German line. These were the same soldiers who had fought their way off Omaha Beach 7 weeks earlier, now hardened by weeks of hedgerow fighting. As chronicled in Stars and Stripes, the official newspaper of the American Armed Forces, the breakthrough came faster than anyone had anticipated. The 4th Infantry Division, supported by the 2nd Armored Division, punched through the German line near Marigny and began advancing rapidly toward the southwest. For the first time since D-Day, Allied forces were moving in the open countryside, rather than fighting for every hedgerow. The German response was hampered by their rigid command structure and the absence of reserves. The 7th Army, commanded by SS Oberfuhrer Paul Hauser, had been weakened by weeks of attritional fighting and could not plug the gap that Cobra had torn in their line. The German armored reserves were scattered across the front, unable to concentrate for an effective counterattack. By July 28th, American forces had advanced over 15 miles from their starting positions. The breakthrough had become a breakout, with armored columns racing across the Norman countryside toward the Brittany ports. The hedgerow fighting that had characterized the Normandy campaign was giving way to a war of movement that favored the Allies with their superior mobility and air support. The psychological impact of Operation Cobra was as significant as its tactical success. German morale, already shaken by weeks of defensive fighting, began to crack under the pressure of constant retreat. Many units that had fought tenaciously in the bocage began to disintegrate. Once they were forced into the open, the Atlantic wall had been not just breached but completely shattered. General George Patton, whose 3rd Army was secretly preparing to enter the battle, watched the developing situation with growing excitement. The flamboyant commander had been relegated to commanding a fictional army group as part of the deception operations, but now he would finally get his chance to lead American forces in the breakout. That would change the course of the war. Lieutenant Colonel William Harrison studied the map spread across the hood of his Jeep, his finger tracing the rapidly changing front lines that showed German forces in full retreat across Normandy. The success of Operation Cobra had opened floodgates that the enemy could not close, and now American, British, and Canadian forces were converging on the small town of Falaise in what promised to be the greatest encirclement battle of the Western Front. Sir, reconnaissance reports German columns streaming east toward the Seine, reported Captain Thomas Wright, his voice carrying a mixture of excitement and disbelief. After weeks of grinding attritional warfare in the bocage, the sudden collapse of German resistance seemed almost too good to be true. The Wehrmacht units that had fought so tenaciously for every hedgerow were now fleeing in apparent panic. The architect of this disaster was Adolf Hitler himself, whose refusal to authorize a strategic withdrawal had doomed the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army to encirclement. The Führer's obsession with holding every inch of ground had prevented Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge from conducting the fighting retreat that might have saved his forces. Instead, German units found themselves trapped in an ever-shrinking pocket around the town of Falaise. General George Patton's Third Army had burst from the Cobra breakthrough. Like a coiled spring suddenly released, the flamboyant commander's armored columns were racing across France at a pace that recalled the German Blitzkrieg of 1940. The 4th Armored Division had advanced over 60 miles in just 3 days, capturing the crucial town of Avranches and opening the gateway to Brittany. The German counterattack at Mortain represented Hitler's last desperate attempt to restore the situation in Normandy. Operation Lettich, launched on August 6th, was supposed to cut through the American lines and recapture Avranches, thereby sealing off the breakout. The assault was spearheaded by the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich and the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, 2 of Germany's most elite units. The attack initially achieved some success, with German panzers advancing several miles before being stopped by determined American resistance. The 30th Infantry Division, supported by tank destroyers and artillery, held the crucial town of Mortain despite being virtually surrounded. The defenders were aided by perfect weather that allowed Allied fighter bombers to operate with devastating effect against the exposed German armor. Meanwhile, the Canadian First Army under General Harry Crerar was attacking southward from Caen toward Falaise, seeking to close the northern jaw of the trap. Operation Total Eyes, launched on August 7th, featured an innovative night attack by armored forces, supported by converted Sherman tanks carrying infantry. The assault made good initial progress against the fanatical resistance of the 12th SS Panzer Division. As documented in official Canadian war records, the fighting around Falaise reached a level of intensity that shocked even veteran commanders. The Hitler Youth Division, now reduced to a fraction of its original strength, continued to fight with desperate courage. Many of the teenage soldiers had never known anything but Nazi rule, and they viewed the battle as a final test of their ideology. The jaws of the trap were slowly closing around the German forces. American units advancing from the south had linked up with British forces moving eastward, while Canadian troops pushed down from the north. The German forces found themselves compressed into an ever smaller area, subjected to constant artillery fire and air attacks that made movement during daylight hours virtually impossible. Field Marshal Walter Model, who had replaced von Kluge as commander of Army Group B, recognized that the situation was hopeless. The master of defensive warfare, who had earned his reputation on the Eastern Front, could see that the German forces in Normandy were doomed. His requests for permission to withdraw were rejected by Hitler, who continued to believe that a successful counterattack could restore the situation. The civilian population of the Falaise region found themselves trapped in the middle of the greatest battle fought on French soil since the Franco-Prussian War. Villages that had survived for years of occupation were being systematically destroyed by the fighting. French civilians huddled in cellars and abandoned buildings, many becoming casualties in the crossfire between the opposing forces. By August 15th, the German pocket had been reduced to a narrow corridor barely 10 miles wide. Desperate Wehrmacht and SS units were streaming eastward through this gap, abandoning their heavy equipment in a frantic attempt to escape encirclement. The roads were clogged with destroyed vehicles and abandoned guns, testament to the effectiveness of Allied air power. The Battle of Normandy was entering its final phase, but the cost had been enormous for both sides. The German forces in the pocket were fighting with the courage of desperation, knowing that capture might mean death at the hands of enemies who had witnessed too many atrocities. The liberation of Europe was being won, but the price was being paid in blood on the fields of Normandy. Major General Philippe Leclerc stood in the turret of his Sherman tank, watching the spires of Paris emerge from the morning mist as the French 2nd Armored Division approached the suburbs of the city. They had dreamed of liberating. The Free French commander had waited for long years for this moment, and now his forces were about to fulfill Charles de Gaulle's promise that French soldiers would be the first to enter their liberated capital. Mon General, we have contact with the resistance, reported Colonel Pierre Bellot, his voice crackling through the radio. The French colonel commanded the unit that would have the honor of entering Paris first, and his men were eager to prove themselves worthy of the trust placed in them. Behind them, the American 4th Infantry Division was ready to provide support if needed. But General Dwight Eisenhower had agreed that French forces should lead the liberation of their own capital. The Falaise pocket had finally been closed 3 days earlier, trapping the remnants of 2 German armies in a cauldron of destruction. The final battle had been a massacre, with Allied artillery and air power systematically destroying anything that moved within the shrinking perimeter. An estimated 50,000 German soldiers had been killed or wounded, while another 200,000 had been taken prisoner. The cream of the German army in the West had been eliminated. Field Marshal Walter Model's desperate attempts to keep an escape corridor open had failed in the face of overwhelming Allied pressure. The German forces that managed to escape the pocket were largely demoralized stragglers who had abandoned their heavy equipment. The Wehrmacht's carefully constructed defensive positions in Normandy had been not just breached, but completely shattered. The collapse of German resistance in Normandy had opened the floodgates for the Allied advance across France. Patton's Third Army was racing eastward toward the German border, while Montgomery's forces were advancing along the Channel coast. The liberation that had begun on the beaches of Normandy was spreading across Western Europe like wildfire. In Paris, the German garrison commander, General Dietrich von Choltitz, faced an impossible situation. Hitler's orders were explicit. The city was to be defended to the last man, and if it could not be held, it was to be destroyed. The Führer had specifically ordered that Paris should not fall into Allied hands except as a field of ruins. Explosive charges had been placed on all the major bridges and monuments, ready to reduce the City of Light to rubble. The French resistance, led by Henry Roltanguy, had risen in revolt on August 19th, taking control of key points throughout the city. The communist-led insurrection had been coordinated with the approaching Allied forces, and now the sound of gunfire echoed through the streets as German troops fought to maintain control of their increasingly isolated strongholds. According to wartime reports from Associated Press correspondent Don Whitehead, the German forces in Paris were displaying none of the fanatical resistance that had characterized their defense of Normandy. Many were older reservists who had no desire to die for a regime that was clearly collapsing. The younger SS troops were more determined, but they were vastly outnumbered by the aroused population of the city. Von Choltitz found himself torn between his oath of loyalty to Hitler and his conscience as a German officer. The destruction of Paris would serve no military purpose and would only add to the burden of guilt that Germany would carry after the war. In a decision that would save one of the world's great cities, he chose to ignore the Führer's orders and seek terms with the approaching Allied forces. The formal surrender of Paris took place on August 25th, with General Leclerc accepting the German capitulation. In the name of the Provisional Government of the French Republic, the German garrison marched into captivity, while jubilant Parisians filled the streets to welcome their liberators. Church bells that had been silent for 4 years rang out across the city, proclaiming the end of the occupation. Charles de Gaulle arrived in Paris that same day, walking down the Champs-Élysées in a triumph that marked the restoration of French sovereignty. The towering leader of the Free French movement had refused to accept defeat in 1940, and now he was returning to claim his place as the leader of liberated France. The crowd that gathered to welcome him represented not just the joy of liberation, but the rebirth of a nation. The Battle of Normandy was officially over, but its consequences would reshape the world. The successful invasion had opened the second front that Stalin had long demanded, forcing Germany to fight on two fronts simultaneously. The Wehrmacht's reserves had been decimated in the Norman bocage, leaving the path to Germany itself increasingly open. As the sun set on August 25th, 1944, the liberation of Western Europe was well underway. The Allied forces that had stormed ashore at Normandy 11 weeks earlier were now racing toward the German border, carrying with them the hopes and dreams of millions of enslaved Europeans. The Atlantic Wall had not just been breached, it had been completely shattered, and with it, Hitler's hopes of victory in the West. The young soldiers who had waded ashore through the surf at Omaha Beach had proven that free men could overcome any obstacle when fighting for a just cause. The Battle of Normandy had been won, but the road to final victory still lay ahead. The liberation of Europe had begun, and nothing would stop it now.